A book I couldn't put down this year was Tracy Flick Can't Win by Tom Perrotta. This is the sequel to his 90s classic Election, which was made into a movie starring Reese Witherspoon as the titular Tracy Flick, the super high overachieving high school student. This book is a sequel to that and picks up 20 or so years later and finds Tracy Flick in middle-aged and nowhere where she thought she was. She didn't become president. She has to settle for becoming the vice principal at a high school who is hopefully finally in line to take over for a beloved retiring principal. The book talks about how Tracy deals with her ambitions from childhood and where she finds herself now in life. It also reflects heavily back on the affair, as she calls it, that she had with a teacher that was covered in the book Election in light of the modern Me Too movement. Tom Perrotta is a master at creating high drama from seemingly low-stakes situations. There's also a plot where the high school wants to create a high school hall of fame, and drama ensues when the frontrunner becomes the lone athletic football star who has his own hidden life filled with divorce, pain, infidelity, and probably CTE. Perrotta is a master of bringing a pitch-black sense of humor to some really serious topics. Perrotta creates high drama from the small complexities behind the normal, seemingly normal facades of middle-aged, teenage, suburban life. No one is as simple as the image that they project to the world. Everyone carries their own baggage, traumas, and histories, which affect the drama in explosive ways. Perrotta brings his signature style here with his short, direct syntax and sentence structures, which somehow, simple though they may be, illuminate the very complex, flawed, and diverse characters in this book, Tracy Flick Can't Win.
So I read The Woman in the Library. The author is Solara Gentile, and I actually read it on audiobook, so the narrator was Catherine Littrell. So the book is at the surface level. It's a mystery. 4 people are sitting in a reading room of the library, and they hear a scream, and someone has been murdered. So each chapter begins with the story of Hannah and Leo, and it's in a written letter format. Hannah is the fictional author of the story that we are reading, and her friend Leo is a super fan of her work as well as a writer himself. So what I loved about this book is how at first it seems like a basic mystery, but there's so many layers to the story beyond that. It covers psychology, mystery, friendship, romance, and also it talks about the craft of writing. And I definitely recommend, again, checking out the audiobook because the narrator is amazing.
Okay. So one of my favorite books this year was Remarkably Bright Creatures by Shelby Van Pelt. In this book, Tova is a 70-year-old woman who works nights cleaning the local aquarium. She's figured out that keeping busy is the best way for her to cope with the tragedies she's had in her life. That's what she did when her son disappeared and they never found his body or knew what happened to him, and that's how she's dealing with her husband's recent passing. One night after her shift cleaning at the aquarium, she finds the aquarium's giant Pacific octopus trapped under cords in the break room, surrounded by empty takeout containers. Returning Marcellus the octopus to his tank and saving his life, the two of them share an unlikely connection. At the same time, we read about 30-year-old Cameron, who is searching for his father, a father he's never known, hoping he can help him out of some financial trouble. The book is told from each of their perspectives. Yes, it's Tova, Cameron, and even the octopus Marcellus, who is a curmudgeon, and his narration is told like a prison diary. It's set in the picturesque Pacific Northwest, and it's perfect for some armchair travel. You're going to really care about all of these characters and really hope for their happy ending.
All right, so this year I read about 3 books that really stood out to me. One is a picture book, one's a middle school book, and one is a young adult book. The first book is Sally Ann McFidget-Bottoms by Howard Perlstein. I really liked this. It was about an elementary age girl who struggles with fidgeting in school, and it often gets her in trouble. And one day it kind of blows up in her face when she lets the class rat go, and she gets sent to the principal's office. And the principal gives her some coping mechanisms for her fidgets, because he tells her everyone has fidgets, and that's a good thing to know. And it just resonated with me because I was a very fidgety kid and I couldn't sit still and I got in a lot of trouble. And it's nice to see that in this day and age, there's books to teach kids how to cope with their fidgets and say, hey, you're not the only one who does this, and that there's sensory tools available to help kids with that. So I really liked this book. It's silly, it's funny, the illustrations are good, and the message is great.
It's titled I Must Betray You by Ruta Zapatis. Now, this takes place in the 1989 era of Romanian, and their situation is that they have a dictator. The story actually centers on a high school student, Cristian Florescu. He lives in a very tiny apartment with his sister and his parents and his very religious and rebellious grandfather. So the book is about Cristian and his story of what it's like to live under a government that very often blackmails its own people to spy on the family and friends. And I enjoyed knowing the many details about the everyday life in Romania at this time, how they needed to stand in line for their food, their cooking oil. The secret police are always watchful over all of their events. And if they discover a person, for example, possessing a can of Coke, that could be enough to put someone in prison. Cristian is forced to inform on a U.S. diplomat in order to exchange medicine for his ill grandfather. He keeps a diary of things that he will use to document later on the atrocities of the regime. And eventually, he is part of the uprising in 1989 that leads to the revolution that actually does lead to the overthrow and execution by firing squad of the dictator. I was just amazed at the way this story develops and transforms over the years with the people living in these kinds of conditions and the constant surveillance by the secret police that ultimately does lead to the overthrow of the dictatorship. I thought it was really interesting to see how the heavy burdens on these high school students, as young as they are, that they carry these burdens and that they're able to avoid being noticed or stopped by the police and sent to prison. And I think we should all probably be aware of the history of the regimes that are still in the world that have this kind of situation.
My favorite graphic novel I read this year was Lifetime Passes by Terry Bloss. It's kind of a macabre graphic novel. You need to have a little bit of a dark sense of humor, but it actually has some really great lessons. The book is about a teen girl named Jackie. Her parents have been deported. She's now living with her aunt. She has to have a job. She works at a senior home to help support her aunt. And she has just found out that because of all these things, she can no longer afford her season pass to the local amusement park. But a loophole, she finds out that the amusement park gives away free lifetime passes if anyone in your party dies while they are at the park. So now remember, she's working at a nursing home. There's plenty of old people there. It's really, really funny. I promise there are no gruesome deaths. There is one injury, but you'll probably feel pretty good about it.
The Many Daughters of Afong Moy is a book I read that I really enjoyed. It's kind of historical fiction, but it also spans many generations and centuries. It's based on a real person. So Afong Moy is the first female Chinese immigrant to the United States who landed in the U.S. in 1834. And she kind of had this troubled history, so she wasn't going to the U.S. of her own volition. And she ended up in a weird situation where she was basically used as a marketing tool. She was an attraction, and that was used to sell Chinese goods. There's no record of her death, so we don't know what happened to her, but the author Jamie Ford imagines her full life. So she's kind of like what ties all of this story together, and then the rest of the characters are her imagined descendants. Dorothy is kind of our main character besides Afong Moy, and she lives in Seattle in the year 2045. She's a poet, and she kind of starts to have these flashbacks of memories that aren't her own. When her 5-year-old daughter Annabelle also starts to kind of experience the same thing, Dorothy decides that she wants to kind of seek treatment, and it's all experimental, but it's based on epigenetics, which is the theory that behavior and trauma can be passed down through generations. As Dorothy kind of explores this therapy and understands and looks more fully at the memories that she's experiencing flashbacks of, we also learn about other characters that are Afong Moy's supposed descendants. So we learn about Lai King Moy, who is living in San Francisco in the early 1900s during the bubonic plague outbreak. Zoe Moy takes us to 1927 in England at a very unconventional boarding school. Faye Moy is a nurse who serves with the Flying Tigers, which is a combat air squadron to fight against the Japanese during World War II. Greta Moy is a developer who creates a dating app just for women in 2014. This book was really interesting if you like a little bit of historical fiction, but also just kind of exploring what ties us together and the idea of epigenetics and generational trauma. This is worth checking out.
And the next book I really liked this year was called Willowdean by Catherine Applegate. She is one of my favorite children's authors. It's a middle school book about the environment. It takes place in a fantasy world called Perchance, so it's a little village, and they have this big festival every year of the honey bears, and all of a sudden the honey bears start to go missing, and people start removing a species they don't really care for called the screechers, but those are Willowdean's favorite creatures, even though they're very annoying. And her and her friend decide to go on kind of an adventure to save the environment and save the honey bears and save her village. And I really like this because it's a fun way to explore environmentalism, a fun way to explore how we can do little activist things in our everyday life, but it takes place in a fantasy world, which I always really enjoy. And it's just a really cute, simple story about a little girl on a mission to save her village and the big tourist attraction.
This year, I loved the newest book by Silvia Moreno Garcia, The Daughter of Dr. Moreau. This book finds Moreno Garcia continuing her project of re-examining and remixing classic genre works with a Mexican historical cultural twist. Here she takes on science fiction adventure. So you probably know the plot already. Dr. Moreau is a scientist who's creating human-animal hybrids in an isolated location. Moreno Garcia has switched the setting from the 19th century South Pacific to the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico in 1877, a time of political strife and rebellion. H.G. Wells' original story talked about the horrors of vivisection and delved into themes of what it means to be human. Moreno Garcia uses this structure and story to really talk about 19th century colonialism and its effect on Mexican history. The story is told through alternating chapters from the perspective of Carlotta, the daughter of Dr. Moreau, and Montgomery, the kind of world-weary, functional alcoholic British expat who is hired to take care of the hybrids and run the kind of hacienda for Dr. Moreau. Here, Moreau is creating the hybrids to be used as basically slave labor for his wealthy benefactor, the Lizalde family, who are the descendants of British colonialists. I would say the first part starts a bit slow, but this is where she's really building these characters and getting you to invest in each of their histories and their place in the story. The middle part, which is usually the hardest part of a book to get through and the hardest to write, I found really captivating, and that's really where she focuses on the love story between Carlotta and the Lizalde family's son, Eduardo. And it all wraps up in a fast-moving, action-packed third half, which I can't spoil for you here, but if you know the Dr. Moreau story, you can kind of see probably where it's going. Silvia Moreno Garcia hits another one out of the park in an incredibly fun way, so I definitely recommend checking it out.
One of my other favorite books for the year is Calling for a Blanket Dance by Oscar Hokia. Okay, so at its core, this book is a multi-generational family fiction told from 12 different perspectives, which it sounds like a lot, but hear me out. So the very first chapter is told by the first narrator, is a mother narrating her family which is herself, her husband, and her baby, who's only like 3 or 4 months old, visiting her husband's parents in Mexico for the first time he's visited in 10 years. It's this trip that's a real cornerstone in their family history, as it completely changes the course of their lives. There's a brutal beating by the police of her husband that results in lifelong kidney problems. And so it completely changes how their life may have ended up. And so it starts there in 1976, and we're told that the baby's life through the different family members over the course of 30 to 40 years. So it starts in 1976, goes to 2013, where we're finally in the very last chapter. Ever Guimesaddle speaks for himself at that end point. And so using all of these different narrators through time, we really get an in-depth look into Ever's life from an interesting third-party perspective. It really goes into how Ever is trying to live with honor, as the author puts it, through the increasing aggression that he experiences as a half-Native American, half-Mexican man in Oklahoma. I found it deeply moving, and while there's not a lot of action or necessarily identifiable plot points, I was riveted by Evers and his family's story.
This Time Tomorrow by Emma Straub is a book about Alice, who is almost 40. She is living in New York City. She is living an okay life. It's not exactly like she would have imagined for herself. She has a romantic partner, but they're not really going anywhere. She kind of has this feeling that he's going to propose soon, so she has to figure out what to do about that. She is working at a private school in New York City as an administrator, and it's the school that she attended. She's kind of at the age now that she's seeing a lot of her old classmates who are coming to enroll their children in the school. She's not exactly unhappy about all this, but it's just kind of like weird. And she's reflecting on her life as she approaches 40. The other huge thing happening in her life is that her father is in the hospital. He's dying, and she's really disturbed by this because her father raised her as a single father, and so their relationship is really close, and so she's anticipating losing him. On the eve of her 40th birthday, she has dinner with her best friend, who she went to that private school with, but who now has a totally different life. After dinner, Alice goes out on her own and gets wasted, and she kind of like stumbles and wanders back to her dad's home, her childhood home, and passes out. And in the morning, she wakes up and she is 16, and her dad is like healthy and everything's cool, and it's like she has time traveled somehow. So like as she's going through the day, she's kind of figuring out how this was possible, and she gets to basically relive the day of her 16th birthday and make tiny small choices that, you know, the next morning she wakes up at 40 and she'll see the repercussions of those small choices. But this is a really sweet book, inspired by the author Emma Straub. Her father was in the hospital for a few months, and so she was just reflecting and kind of wanted a sweet way to have more time with her father. This book is kind of time travel-y, but mostly about the little decisions that you make in your life and how they add up to something bigger.
The first one is The Diamond Eye by Kate Quinn. It's about a Ukrainian-Russian woman who enlists with the Red Army in World War II. Eventually, she becomes known for her record of over 300 sniper kills against the Nazi invaders. This is a very serious book. It is based on historical fact, actually based on the autobiography of the woman, Myla Pavlichenko, and about how she struggles during World War II to be raising her own young son and then eventually fighting in the war against the Nazis. She becomes a very super marksman and is awarded the school's awards for sharpshooting badges and marksman certificates. Then in 1937, she enrolls in the Red Army Sniping School, and when the Nazis invade the Soviet Union, she enthusiastically enlists to protect the homeland. I thought it was very interesting to see how Myla actually copes with the discrimination that she has because she's the only woman in her unit in the Red Army. Eventually, she does advance in rank to become a lieutenant, so then she's the one giving the orders. The details of how a sniper studies and scouts the target may seem very grim, but in war, survival does rule. Now, in 1942, her reputation has become so great that she's become a hero to Stalin's army, and they ask her to tour America, which she does. She's only 25 years old at this point, and she has 309 kills against the Nazis. One of my favorite parts of the book is when she gets to meet President Franklin Roosevelt. At the White House, she is actually the first citizen to be received by a U.S. president. And Mrs. Roosevelt, Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt, strikes up a friendship with her and actually takes her on a tour of the United States. I really enjoyed the uniqueness of this story, grim as it was, and the historical details were so real, and I'd never read a book about a sniper, let alone a woman sniper. So I thought it was very interesting, and I think everyone would enjoy it that likes historical fiction.
The other book I read was 54 Things Wrong with Gwendolyn Rogers by Kayla Carter. This is a children's book. So when Gwen accidentally sees an IEP from her school, she comes up with a list of things to fix herself, 54 of them. And this is a story about living life with a disability that is hard to understand and diagnose. And what I really loved about the story was just how approachable it was for a younger audience. And the character Gwen, she's very funny, she's a little snarky, and that was my favorite thing about that one.
The final book I read this year that really blew me away it's a young adult book called The Silence That Binds Us by Joanna Ho. This book deals with the very heavy topic of suicide. And so I was a little nervous to read it because I don't love a heavy topic, but they handled it with such grace. And the story is of an Asian boy who commits suicide, and then the community blames the parents because they put too much pressure on him. And this becomes a contentious issue, especially because it starts to lead to some racism. And again, I was a little worried that this would be too heavy, but they really bring you into the story and teach you a little bit about how race plays into how we perceive different people. And it shows a girl who's asked by her family to please keep quiet. We don't want to flare any issues up in the community. Things are bad enough. And instead of listening, she decides to stand up for herself, for her brother, tell her story. And really the book asks the question, who is allowed to tell our stories? Who's allowed to give a voice to what we're experiencing? And May, the main character, decides to take this into her own hands with the help of friends. And she stands up for her brother, and she, I would say, makes the community a better place, but it also opens up conversation for the reader to have with their family, with their friends. This was for a book club that I'm in, and it was particularly topical and timely, and it was really quite a book that, despite the heavy topic, really blew me away with how absolutely wonderful the storytelling was.
My favorite YA novel I read this year is A Forgery of Roses by Jessica S. Olson. It is a gothic fantasy murder mystery. So it is about a teen girl named Myra. She has a special form of magic. She is an artist, and whatever she paints becomes true. So let's say you don't like your hair color. She can paint you with a different hair color, and poof, magic, it happens. This is not a power that she wants announced to the public, though. It is looked down upon. But then the governor approaches Myra and offers her a job that she can't turn down. She wants her to paint her dead son back to life. Myra's not even sure she can do that, but she tries, and when she gets there, she finds out that his death wasn't as innocent as everyone's painting it to be. So I was pleasantly surprised. I really enjoyed it. I wasn't expecting to like that one as much. So if you like dark murder mysteries, a little bit of fantasy, I definitely recommend this one.